August 15, 1945. Noon. The air over Tokyo hung heavy with smoke and uncertainty. On the radio, static gave way to a trembling voice that no Japanese citizen had ever heard before, the voice of Emperor Hirohito himself. In living rooms across the shattered empire, families knelt before the speakers as if in prayer. Mothers held their children close. Fathers, once soldiers or factory workers, sat motionless, their hands still blackened from soot. The emperor's words were slow, formal, and strange. To endure the unendurable, to suffer what is insufferable. The meaning sank in only gradually. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But in that silence that followed his speech, there was no relief, only disbelief. The empire of 1,000 years had fallen, and no one knew what awaited them next. In a small wooden house in Yokohama, 10-year-old Akira crouched beside his mother, eyes fixed on the small radio that crackled on the table. The tatami mats beneath them smelled of ash and sea salt. His father had not returned from the Pacific. His mother, Kimiko, kept her face blank, though her hands trembled. "It's finished," she whispered, but the word "finished" didn't sound like victory or even peace. It sounded like the closing of the world itself. Outside, a thin dog barked once, then stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang for the dead. For years, Akira had been told that Americans were demons in human skin, giants with red hair who would tear babies from their mothers. School posters showed grotesque caricatures of grinning soldiers. His teacher, Mr. Saito, once told the class that to be captured by Americans was worse than death. "They will never show mercy," he'd said, his voice shaking with both authority and fear. So when word spread that the Americans were coming real flesh-and-blood soldiers, most families sealed their homes and buried what little food they had left. Kimiko hid a small pouch of rice beneath the floorboards and told Akira, "If they come, we stay quiet. Don't look them in the eyes." Days passed like that, long, waiting days, the sky bruised with late summer heat. The city, or what was left of it, fell hollow. Entire neighborhoods were flattened by the fire bombings that had come months earlier. The once bustling markets were reduced to charred skeletons of stalls. People scavenged through ruins for burnt soybeans or bits of metal they could trade. At night, Akira sometimes thought he heard the sky whispering, the low hum of aircraft, but it was only wind through the broken eaves. On August 28th, the Americans landed at Atsugi Airfield. Rumor reached Yokohama by morning. "They're here," someone whispered at the communal well. They came in trucks and jeeps. "They have guns, but they didn't shoot." Kimiko drew in her breath sharply, then gathered Akira's hand. "Stay close," she said. They moved through the ghosts of their neighborhood, watching others peek from behind collapsed walls. No one dared approach the main street, where the first convoys were rumored to pass. Akira's first glimpse of an American soldier came that afternoon. A group of them appeared at the end of the lane, tall, broad-shouldered, faces shaded by helmets. The metallic clatter of their gear echoed unnervingly. Kimiko pulled Akira behind a half-burned telephone pole. The soldiers were laughing among themselves, their voices loud, alien, almost carefree. One of them carried a camera and took photographs of the rubble as if it were some strange museum exhibit. Another wiped sweat from his brow and muttered something Akira couldn't understand. The boy's heart thudded painfully. He expected them to kick in doors, to shout, to drag people into the street. But instead, the soldiers stopped when they saw a small group of children watching from the ruins. One of the soldiers, tall, sandy-haired, maybe no older than 20, reached into his pack and pulled out something shiny and square. He knelt, held out toward a trembling girl of about Akira's age. No one moved. The soldier smiled gently, opened the wrapper, and broke the brown slab in half. He took a bite himself, then offered the other piece again. The girl hesitated, then stepped forward. She took it with both hands, bowed awkwardly, and bit into it. Her face changed, first confusion, then astonishment. "Sweet," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The other soldiers laughed softly. Akira stared, mesmerized. He had not seen chocolate before. To him, the brown bar might as well have been a piece of treasure or medicine. Kimiko whispered sharply, "Don't. Stay here." But Akira's curiosity was stronger than fear. He stepped from behind the pole, his small frame covered in soot and rags. The sandy-haired soldier noticed him, smiled again, and tossed a small wrapped piece his way. It landed near Akira's feet. The boy froze. The world held its breath. Kamiko hissed his name, but Akira bent, picked up the package, and unwrapped it with shaking fingers. The smell hit him first, rich, warm, strange. He bit it for a moment. The taste flooded every nerve in his body. It was sweet, creamy, utterly foreign. Tears stung his eyes before he even knew why. The soldier waved lightly, then turned back to his group. They continued down the street, leaving behind footprints and laughter. For hours after they disappeared, Akira stood silent. Kamiko looked at him, then at the half-melted candy in his palm. She didn't speak. There were no words for what she had just witnessed. These were the enemies who had bombed their city, who had taken her husband, and yet they had offered her son food. It was a gesture so small, and yet so disorienting that she felt dizzy. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with cautious talk. Someone claimed the Americans were distributing bread at the harbor. Another said they'd seen soldiers helping repair a bridge. Old Mr. Saito, the teacher, shook his head in disbelief. "It's a trick," he said bitterly. "They want us calm before the real cruelty begins." But his voice lacked conviction. Even he had seen the soldiers give candy to children. In the dim light of their home, Kamiko divided the last of their rice into 2 bowls. Akira sat cross-legged, chewing slowly. The sweetness of the chocolate still lingered on his tongue. "Mother," he said suddenly, "they didn't look like devils." Kamiko hesitated, her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. "Don't say such things," she murmured, but there was no strength behind it. She looked out through the cracked window at the smoky horizon. "The war is over," she said finally, "but maybe peace is not what we thought it would be." Outside, somewhere near the docks, American trucks rumbled into the city. The engine's low growl mixed with the distant sound of waves. People listened, half in fear, half in something else. Hope, perhaps, though no one dared name it. Akira lay down beside his mother, clutching the shiny candy wrapper in his fist like a talisman. The metallic paper caught a faint glimmer of moonlight through the window. He thought of his father, somewhere far away, of his teacher's stern voice, of the emperor's distant tone that morning. None of it made sense anymore. The world had turned upside down in a single day. The Americans were here, and they had brought not fire, but food. As he drifted toward sleep, he wondered if tomorrow they would return, if the man with the sandy hair would smile again, if maybe, just maybe, the strange sweetness was the first taste of something larger than survival. The war was finished, but something else, something unexpected and fragile, was just beginning to take shape in the ruins of Japan. The first American trucks entered Yokohama beneath a pale September sun. Dust rose from the broken streets as engines rumbled through the skeleton of the city. Windows that had been shuttered for weeks cracked open just enough for eyes to peer out. For many Japanese civilians, it was the first time they had seen foreigners, living, breathing symbols of their defeat. Kamiko stood at the doorway of her home with Akira clutching her sleeve. The boy's wide eyes followed every movement of the convoy as it passed. Soldiers waving, tires crunching glass, the faint glimmer of helmets catching the light. The soldiers did not look like the devils of wartime posters. They looked like young men who had walked too far, too long, and carried the weight of victory uneasily. Akira spotted the sandy-haired soldier again, the same one who had given him chocolate. The man rode in the back of a jeep this time, his helmet tilted, his rifle slung loosely across his chest. He caught sight of the boy and gave a small, almost embarrassed wave. Akira lifted his hand shyly, then dropped it before his mother could scold him. Kamiko said nothing. She only watched as the convoy disappeared down the street, leaving behind a trail of dust and confusion. In the days that followed, the Americans became a regular presence. They moved through the neighborhoods distributing leaflets printed in careful Japanese, explaining that they came not as conquerors but as friends. The word seemed absurd at first. People whispered that it was propaganda, a trick to lure them into complacency. Yet the soldiers kept returning, bringing crates of supplies, rice, powdered milk, canned peaches, and setting up aid stations near the docks. Kamiko resisted the urge to go. pride, or perhaps habit anchored her. She had survived by expecting nothing from anyone, least of all the enemy. But Akira begged her to take him to the station where, he'd heard, American soldiers handed out bread. "Just to see," he said. "Please, Mother." The aid station was a repurposed warehouse, its windows patched with sheets of tin. A line of civilians stretched down the block, mothers, children, old men clutching ration cards. The smell of baking bread drifted from within, dizzying in its unfamiliar abundance. At the entrance, soldiers stood beside large metal containers. One of them was a sandy-haired man. His name, stitched onto his uniform, read Private Miller. He smiled at each person who approached, bowing awkwardly in imitation of local custom. When Kamiko and Akira reached the front of the line, Miller greeted them with a cheerful konnichiwa. His accent bent the syllables strangely, but the effort made Akira grin. Miller ladled thick stew into a tin bowl, then added a slice of bread. "For you," he said slowly, pointing at Akira. "Eat." Kamiko bowed low, murmuring thanks in halting English she barely remembered from school. Miller nodded, tapping his helmet with a laugh. "No problem, ma'am." The food was simple, heavy, and warm. Akira ate quickly, savoring every bite as though afraid it might vanish. Around them, other civilians did the same, the warehouse filled with the quiet sound of eating and the occasional hum of gratitude. It was the first true meal many had tasted in months. When they finished, Kamiko noticed a small crowd of children gathered near another soldier who was showing them how to blow bubbles with chewing gum. The laughter that followed sounded almost unnatural against the backdrop of ruin, like music returning to a place that had forgotten sound. As days turned into weeks, the Americans began repairing what they could. They helped clear debris from the streets, distributed medicine, and even assisted in reopening schools. Mr. Saito, Akira's teacher, was reinstated, though his lessons now included new phrases. Democracy, reconstruction, peace. He spoke them carefully, as if testing their weight. The children repeated after him with uncertain voices. Akira saw Miller often. The soldier seemed to have taken a quiet liking to him, greeting him with a wave whenever their paths crossed. One afternoon, Miller crouched beside Akira near the harbor, showing him how to skip stones across the water. "You throw like this," he said, miming the motion. The stone danced 3 times before sinking. Akira tried and managed 2 skips. Miller laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. For a moment, they were just a man and a boy by the sea, not conqueror and conquered. Kamiko watched from a distance, conflicted. Each act of kindness from the Americans eroded a layer of her resentment. Yet she could not let go of the memories, the bombs, the nights spent hiding, the absence of her husband. When she looked at Miller, she saw both a human being and a reminder of everything she had lost. Still, when he offered her canned food or medicine, she accepted. Survival left little room for pride. Tension, however, remained just beneath the surface. Not all Japanese welcomed the Americans. Some former soldiers muttered that the occupation was humiliation disguised as charity. Others feared collaboration would mark them as traitors. A few incidents flared, arguments over rations, stolen goods, even fistfights, but they were rare. The Americans, under strict orders from General MacArthur, avoided confrontation. Discipline was tight. The soldiers were told to behave not as victors, but as representatives of peace. One evening, Kamiko overheard 2 men at the well discussing the new American commander. "They say he lives in the Imperial Hotel." One said that he made the emperor bow. The other shook his head. "No, he made no such demand. He treats the emperor with respect." The idea seemed impossible, almost absurd, that the supreme commander of the Allied powers would show courtesy to the man once worshipped as divine. Yet such stories began to circulate, and with them, a quiet shift in perception. Akira, too, began to change. The boy who had once flinched at the sound of engines now waved at every passing jeep. He practiced English words Miller taught him. "Hello, thank you, friend." Each syllable felt like a bridge between worlds. Sometimes he would run errands for the soldiers, carrying small parcels or messages, always returned with a grin, and more often than not, a piece of candy. Kamiko scolded him, but secretly watched with wonder. One day, Miller handed Akira a small notebook and pencil. "For school," he said simply. The cover was blue, stamped with the emblem of the U.S. Army. Akira held it as if it were sacred. That night, he copied English letters by candlelight while Kimiko mended clothes. The faint scratch of pencil against paper mingled with the distant hum of American generators. For the first time in months, their home felt alive. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile peace lay the memory of war. Every street still bore scars, walls blackened by fire, gaps where houses once stood. When rain fell, it carried the smell of ash back into the air. Kimiko often wondered if the Americans understood what they had destroyed. And yet, when she watched Miller laughing with children, she began to suspect that perhaps they did. Perhaps kindness was their way of trying to rebuild what bombs had broken. Winter approached. Relief shipments increased, and so did the presence of American patrols. People grew used to their accents, their laughter, their clumsy attempts at Japanese greetings. The fear that once defined every interaction had begun to dissolve into something else. Not quite trust, but recognition. Winter approached. Relief shipments increased, and so did the presence of American patrols. People grew used to their accents, their laughter, their clumsy attempts at Japanese greetings. The fear that once defined every interaction had begun to dissolve into something else. Not quite trust, but recognition. One evening, as the sun sank into the harbor, Kimiko stood beside Akira, watching Miller climb into his jeep. He looked tired but smiled when he saw them. "See you tomorrow," he called in careful Japanese. Akira waved eagerly. Kimiko hesitated, then bowed deeply. The soldier returned the gesture with awkward sincerity before driving off. As the rumble of the engine faded, Akira turned to his mother. "He's not the enemy, is he?" he asked. Kimiko's gaze lingered on the empty street. "No," she said quietly, "not anymore." But in her heart, she knew the truth was more complicated. Enemies could become friends. Fear could become gratitude. Yet peace, she sensed, was still learning how to walk. The days of silence were over, replaced by the strange sound of coexistence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new plans for Japan's future were already taking shape. And though neither Kimiko nor Akira could imagine it yet, their small encounters with a single soldier would soon echo in the transformation of an entire nation. By 1947, the gray ruins of Yokohama had begun to stir again. Smoke no longer rose from the rubble. Instead, the smell of fresh plaster and coal drifted through the air. The American trucks still rumbled down the main roads, but now they carried lumber, food, and school supplies instead of weapons. A fragile rhythm of ordinary life had returned, and in its quiet, something unexpected was taking root. Trust, slow and uncertain, like a plant pushing through cracked pavement. Kimiko felt it most mornings when she walked Akira to school, their path lined with men rebuilding walls and women sweeping ashes from doorways that no longer led anywhere. Akira was taller now, his once thin frame filling out from months of steady meals. The American food aid had changed more than his body. It had softened the edges of his fear. His blue notebook, a gift from Private Miller, was filled with neat lines of English words and clumsy sketches of airplanes and ships. He no longer flinched when he saw American soldiers. Instead, he called out greetings in halting phrases that made them smile. Miller had become a fixture in their lives, visiting the neighborhood weekly to distribute supplies and check on the families. What had begun as cautious gratitude between him and Kimiko had grown into a quiet friendship. They spoke little. Her English was still poor, his Japanese no better, but there was understanding in gestures, in exchange of small kindnesses that required no translation. One rainy afternoon, Miller arrived at their door carrying a wooden crate. Inside were cans of milk, a loaf of bread, and a small metal tin. "For Akira," he said, setting it down. The boy's eyes widened when he opened it. A baseball glove, warm but still good. "You play," Miller said, miming a throw. Akira laughed, slipping his hand inside the glove. "Play," he echoed. The sound of that word lingered in the air, fragile and hopeful. Yet beneath the warmth of these moments lay unease. Kimiko knew that many still resented the Americans. At the market, whispers passed between vendors about soft occupation and cultural invasion. Some elders said Japan was forgetting its dignity. Others said pride could not fill an empty stomach. Even Mr. Saito, once a believer in the new democracy, now grumbled about the children learning American songs instead of traditional poems. "They want to make us into them," he muttered one morning, erasing English words from the blackboard with a tired hand. Kimiko listened but said nothing. She could not deny that her son's laughter had returned, or that the soldiers who once symbolized ruin now brought medicine and warmth. Yet part of her still resisted. Sometimes at night, she caught herself remembering her husband, whose last letter from the front had spoken of duty and sacrifice. Would he have understood the strange peace? Would he have forgiven her for accepting help from the enemy? Akira, unaware of these shadows, threw himself into his new life. After school, he joined a group of children who played baseball on a cleared patch of land near the harbor. The Americans often joined them, teaching the rules, shouting encouragement, and laughing at mistakes. Miller, whenever off duty, was their most enthusiastic participant. His Japanese was limited to phrases like "good hit" and "try again," but his energy bridged the language barrier. For the children, baseball became more than a game. It was proof that laughter could live where sirens once wailed. One afternoon, as Akira prepared to bat, he glanced toward the harbor where ships loaded with relief supplies gleamed under the sun. Beyond them, the city skyline was dotted with cranes and scaffolding. The sight filled him with an emotion he couldn't name, something between pride and disbelief. When he struck the ball and it soared higher than ever before, Miller cheered louder than anyone. Kimiko, watching from a distance, smiled despite herself. The sight of her son running, laughing, unafraid, it was more powerful than any victory parade. But even peace brings its own tensions. That winter, word spread that American food aid might soon be reduced as Japan's production recovered. Fear rippled through the neighborhood. Old hunger memories resurfaced, and people lined up at distribution centers long before dawn. Kimiko stood among them one cold morning, clutching Akira's empty rice bag. Miller was there, overseeing the handouts. He looked thinner, more worn, the easy humor in his eyes dimmed by exhaustion. When Kimiko reached the front, he handed her a smaller ration than usual. "Less this week," he said apologetically. "Soon Japan make own food." She nodded, forcing a smile. "Soon," she repeated, but as she walked home, she felt a knot in her chest. The Americans were leaving little by little. Their presence, which had once felt like intrusion, now seemed like protection. Without them, what would remain? Akira noticed a change, too. Miller's visits became less frequent. The baseball games stopped when the soldiers were reassigned. One day, Akira found the field empty, the base paths erased by wind. He sat in the dirt, glove on his knee, staring at the sky. Kimiko approached quietly. "He will come back," she said, though she wasn't sure. "He has other work." Akira didn't answer. He only closed the glove and whispered. He said, "We play again." Weeks passed. Spring came, bringing cherry blossoms that bloomed against ruins like defiance itself. Reconstruction accelerated. Schools reopened fully. Factories hummed. And for the first time since the war, newspapers spoke of prosperity instead of survival. Yet for Kimiko, peace felt both real and incomplete. The Americans had shown kindness, but their departure would test whether that kindness had truly taken root. One evening, as she was hanging laundry, she heard familiar footsteps. Turning, she saw Miller approaching, his uniform cleaner than usual, his expression subdued. "Transfer," he said, tapping his chest. "Go home." For a moment, Kimiko couldn't speak. She bowed deeply, then said in careful English, "Thank you for helping." He smiled, shaking his head. "You helped me, too." Akira ran from the house and threw his arms around him, unashamed. Miller knelt, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Keep playing," he said softly. From his pocket, he produced a small photograph of his own family, a wife and baby girl. "My daughter," he explained. "Same age soon." When he left, Kimiko and Akira stood at the gate long after he vanished down the road. The city hummed quietly, alive with rebuilding, yet an emptiness settled over them. That night, Kimiko found the blue notebook on the table, open to a page Akira had written earlier. I want to speak English so I can tell him thank you. The words were crooked, uncertain, but they made her throat tighten. Months later, news spread that Japan's school lunch program had begun nationwide, funded in part by American aid. Each morning, Akira came home describing the bread and milk they were given, his eyes bright. "Miller-san's food," he said proudly. Kimiko smiled. In a way, he was right. The kindness of a single soldier had become something larger, a quiet inheritance passed from one generation to another. By the summer of 1949, Yokohama's streets were lined with shops again. The sounds of carpenters and merchants replaced the echoes of loss. Kimiko no longer waited for trucks or ration lines. She worked at a sewing cooperative founded with American support, her hands steady, her voice stronger. Yet sometimes, when she passed the harbor at dusk, she thought she saw Miller's shadow among the cranes, watching over the city he had helped to rebuild. Akira still played baseball on weekends, now with Japanese teammates and equipment bought from local stores. The field had been restored, the bases freshly marked. As he stood at the plate, bat poised, he thought of the man who had first shown him how to throw, how to laugh without fear. When the ball flew off his bat and arced into the sky, Akira smiled, certain that somewhere, far across the ocean, Miller would have been cheering. Kimiko watched from the sidelines, her heart full. The boy who once hid from soldiers now ran freely beneath the same sun. The city that had burned was breathing again. And though the Americans had gone, their small acts of compassion lingered, woven into the fabric of everyday life. As the wind carried the cheers from the field across the harbor, Kimiko whispered, "Arigato." It was not just for Miller. It was for all the strangers who had brought light to a land that once knew only fire. The war had ended years ago, but peace, at last, was learning to stay. By the early 1950s, Yokohama no longer looked like a wounded city. The streets that once lay broken now pulsed with life. Vendors shouting, bicycles rattling, the steady rhythm of hammers striking wood. Neon signs flickered in the evenings, their English letters glowing like strange constellations above narrow alleys. Japan was rising again, not through conquest, but through quiet persistence. For Kimiko, the transformation felt almost unreal. Each day, as she walked to the sewing cooperative where she worked, she passed storefronts selling American radios, canned goods, and records. The same nation that once dropped fire from the sky now sent music that drifted from open windows. Soft jazz mingled with children's laughter. It was a new kind of invasion, one she no longer feared. Akira was 15 now, taller than Kimiko and bursting with restless energy. He wore his school uniform with a pride his mother recognized, but couldn't quite name. He no longer remembered the taste of hunger. His world was filled with possibility, shaped by teachers who spoke of democracy and dreams. Yet sometimes, when he caught sight of older men bowing too quickly to passing officers, or when he heard whispers about forgetting who we are, he felt a flicker of confusion. The war existed for him only through stories, his mother's silences, the empty space where his father's photograph once stood. To Akira, America was not the enemy of the past, but the architect of the present. At school, English had become a core subject, and Akira excelled at it. His teacher, a woman who had studied under the new education reforms, often asked him to read aloud. His pronunciation carried traces of the man who had once taught him to say friend and thank you. Private Miller's name had faded from conversation, but not from memory. Akira still kept the blue notebook, now filled cover to cover with words and sketches. When asked what inspired him to study, he always answered simply, "A soldier who gave me chocolate." His classmates laughed, but his tone carried no humor, only gratitude. Kimiko watched him grow with both pride and melancholy. The boy who had once clung to her hand now talked of becoming a translator, maybe even traveling abroad. To America, he said one evening over dinner, eyes alight, "I want to see the place he came from." Kimiko looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Then go with open eyes. The world is not divided the way it once was." She tried to sound confident, but inside, she wondered if peace could truly last, or if it was merely a pause between storms. Outside their window, the city hummed with renewal. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, and the harbor gleamed with ships carrying goods to and from the United States. The occupation was drawing to an end, replaced by independence. On April 28, 1952, the San Francisco Peace Treaty came into effect, officially restoring Japan's sovereignty. People flooded the streets waving flags, cheering as if awakening from a long sleep. Kimiko stood at the edge of the crowd, her sewing basket in hand, unsure whether to join the celebration. Independence felt strange when so much of their recovery had been shaped by foreign hands. Still, she smiled as Akira raced ahead to the crowd, waving a small paper flag. In the weeks that followed, the American soldiers departed one by one. Their departure left an emptiness the city hadn't anticipated, a silence between languages, a gap in the rhythm of daily life. Kimiko passed the Old Aid warehouse one afternoon and found it locked, its windows dusty. She stood there for a moment, listening to the echo of voices that once filled it. The laughter, the sound of bowls being set down, the hesitant attempts at shared words. The warehouse, like a closed book, belonged now to memory. Akira began working part-time at a small translation office after school. He handled letters and documents for businessmen, interpreting the English that still threaded through the city's commerce. Sometimes he stayed late, poring over foreign newspapers that spoke of a changing world, Korea, the Cold War, the rise of new powers. Yet what held his attention most were stories about post-war cooperation, the unlikely friendship between former enemies. He read about American teachers visiting Japanese schools, about cultural exchanges and student scholarships. The world, it seemed, was learning from its scars. One evening, while sorting mail at the office, Akira came across an envelope addressed to Miller, Thomas A., USA. The handwriting was faint, but the name made his chest tighten. The letter was part of a shipment of returned mail, undeliverable for reasons unknown. He stared at it for a long time before slipping it into his pocket. That night, he showed it to his mother. "Maybe it's him," he said quietly. Kimiko traced the faded ink with her finger, the name stirring something deep within her. "If it is, then fate has brought him back for a moment," she said. The next day, Akira brought the letter to school and asked his English teacher to help him read it. The words were written in careful but broken English, dated years earlier, 1948. It was from a woman named Haru, a widow who thanked Miller for saving her son during an illness. She wrote that she hoped he was well, that Japan would remember the kindness of men like him. The letter ended simply, "Peace is sweeter than chocolate." Akira folded it carefully, his eyes misting. "He touched many lives," the teacher said softly. "And maybe through people like you, his kindness continues." That evening, Akira sat at his desk with a blue notebook open before him. He copied the phrase, "Peace is sweeter than chocolate," and stared at it until the words blurred. He realized then that his memories of Miller had become less about the man himself and more about what he represented. A moment when compassion outweighed hatred, when one act of generosity changed the course of a child's life. Years later, when Akira stood before his graduating class, chosen to deliver the closing speech, he spoke in fluent English. He told them about post-war Japan, about hunger and rebuilding, about how kindness could come from the most unexpected places. "We were taught to fear," he said, "but we learned to hope. A soldier once gave me chocolate, and I learned that peace begins not with treaties, but with understanding." The hall fell silent, then erupted into applause. Kimiko, sitting in the audience, pressed a hand to her heart. That night, as mother and son walked home beneath a canopy of city lights, Kimiko looked up at the sky. "Your father would be proud," she said. "You've carried something he never had the chance to see." Akira smiled, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "Maybe we've all carried it," he replied. "Maybe that's why we're still standing." The streets of Yokohama shimmered with the reflections of neon signs. Children darted past, laughing, clutching sweets wrapped in bright foil. Kimiko paused to watch them. For an instant, she saw herself in Akira as they had been years ago. The frightened mother, the boy holding his first piece of chocolate. The memory was both distant and vivid, a bridge between two worlds. Peace had not come easily, nor was it perfect, but it was alive, tangible, built from the quiet courage of ordinary people who had chosen to forgive rather than hate. The world beyond Japan's shores remained uncertain, full of tensions and rivalries. Yet within the city, a different lesson endured. Compassion could outlast war. Kindness could rebuild nations. As they reached their home, Kimiko turned once more toward the harbor. The water glowed softly beneath the moon, ships rocking gently as if breathing. She whispered, almost to herself, "He would have liked to see this." Akira looked at her, understanding. "Maybe he does," he said. They stood there in silence, the hum of the city around them, the taste of peace lingering like something remembered and renewed. History, Kimiko thought, was not written only in battles or treaties, but in gestures, small, human, and enduring. And as the night deepened, the lights of Yokohama burned steady, a testament to a simple truth learned long ago, that even in the ruins of war, a piece of chocolate could be the beginning of everything.